And so you see the advent of World War One is only really possible through the way that we have manipulated our agricultural system to build something that is one part entirely destructive or can feed people. I would say that I've always sort of had some sort of tangential experience around food, either a love-hate relationship with it. My first job was at a butcher shop. So I started as 14 years old, working at a butcher shop, 1950s era style, Irish butchers, like salty, crusty, older guys who were trying to make the whole sort of butcher shop thing work. Meanwhile, everybody was just shopping at like your local supermarkets and all of that stuff. So I found that at the time it wasn't something I actually really wanted to get into. But what I found is the arc of my experience over the past, let's say, 30 years, it was probably the grounding that I needed in order to get into an understanding of like how disconnected we are from where our food comes from. Because we would break down in half pigs, quartered beef, chickens. We would any number of different foods that were coming in. We were essentially breaking down. So you can't really kind of if you walk into a Western supermarket, it's so very different from like a French chicken. A French chicken will still have its head on. The feet are still attached. It still looks like it's sort of Velociraptor ancestors.
Hmm.
You can see real talons on there and everything like that. American poultry looks nothing like that experience. And under the guise of like health, most of the skin is even off. So we're getting this weird sort of amalgam of like differing viewpoints on food. And so at the time at 14, obviously you don't that's not the education that you're kind of looking for, but it was probably the education that I needed. And so I've at 18 I joined the military. I didn't really want to know what I want to do with my life. Joined up and went off to basic training and did reserve work for 6 years. So that was a very unique experience because I think growing up in New York City, it's just a very kind of it's a very self-centered it's like London. It's very self-centered. It's like you think the world sort of revolves around this nexus of your of the city view. And so for me, going into basic training, being a basic private, was a real eye-opening experience because I was actually, most of the people were in there for various different reasons, but the majority of them were they were living in rural communities or old like mining communities that had no jobs, no future. And this was in their minds a way out. And then the other part of it was kids who were given the option of 4 years in prison or 4 years in the military. And so in essence became kind of a for lack of a better term, a dumping ground for the dispossessed in America. Kids growing up in, who were part of these multi-generational families that were part of mining interest or farming, who just didn't have any future. And that's where the army recruiters go. They don't go to, Fitzrovia in London, to recruit for new, for new soldiers or anything like that. So I think those were two of the seminal experiences for me.
Hmm.
I sort of ambled around my 20s. I got a degree in illustration and painting, showed in galleries for a number of years, and then kind of got obsessed with cooking. I was living in England at the time. And what I was seeing in England was this whole renaissance of like, Rick Stein's documentaries and shows just about like regionality and food. And, you go to Cornwall and, you just look at all of this sort of rich history of English cooking. And, of course, like you go over there, you're just like, England is generally made fun of for sort of blandness of its food, but it was in no way, from an American's perspective, bland in any sort of fashion. You know, we grew up like fast food in America, right? That's our national, like, you know,
Yes.
cultural export to the rest of the world. It was like Oreos and Nabisco
Thanks for
crackers, and
that. Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate it. You know, and Jamie Oliver and, you know, his campaigns and everything like that. And so when I came back, I studied at a 2 Michelin star restaurant when I was in England, Les Maisons au Croissant, and just became obsessed with it. I was more self-trained than I was trained by any experts, but I really fell in love with food. Kind of went into it kicking and screaming, but then found this real abundance and care. And, you know, you could, like, you know, for me, it was a total introvert, to be able to exist in places where people gather, where I could be cooking and just be part of the conversation without actually, like, you know, kind of float in and out. It was like the perfect experience for me to, like, be around other people, but not necessarily like have to, you know, be entirely focused on conversation or whatever, but always like taking it in tangentially. Um, so when I came back, I did something very similar to what Jamie Oliver was doing. I started a nonprofit foundation in New York City, mainly doing nutrition education, in inner city schools and charter schools in the States. So charter schools are like, they're public schools. You guys call them something else, um, in England. Essentially, like, where, you know, a nationalized school system is, public schools are sort of wealthier, I think. We have it sort of backwards, I think. So they're public schools funded by the city governments and US governments, but charter schools had the ability to hire and fire people, had the ability to change food, school food. You could actually bring a chef in, you could buy local seasonal ingredients within 150 miles of New York. The money was there, it's just you had to have the impetus behind it. And so we would overhaul school food while we were teaching the kids about where their food was coming from. And we were teaching like 1,500 kids a week, you know, food nutrition, gardening programs, African dance, yoga, anything that kind of get them out of the very rigorous academic system that we have nowadays, which is all about, you know, kind of learning, you know, for this like future self that you're supposed to be, right?
Mhm.
You know, like, oh, what are you going to use algebra for? Well, don't worry, you're going to need it at some point in the future.
Yeah, nothing
And so
concrete.
everything is so abstracted within our educational system nowadays, that actually have kids in the dirt playing around with stuff, growing foods, tasting them, combining ingredients, you know, seeing where their food was coming from, visiting farms, you know, anything gets them out of the sort of doldrums of the everyday. Um, so I did that for about a decade. You know, at our height, we were in 18 schools and working with the Obama administration on overhauling school food. And I got really frustrated with fundraising, the nonprofit world, the notion of poverty as like endemic to either a people's or to a class or anything like that.
Mhm.
That intelligence is somehow like, how would you say, like a hereditary experience. You know, negating all of the environmental factors that go into education, stress levels, like all the things that you like focus on, sleep. You know, you have a lot of families that are working nights. You have a lot of families that are, um, you know, working multiple shifts that change on a daily basis. You have all of these stress factors affecting a child's education, at home and in school. And if you have, at least within the school districts, you have 60% of the meals are coming from the Department of Education, breakfast and lunch and afternoon snacks and all of that stuff. It can be nutritious. It can help with every part of their, you know, growing up, getting them out, playing, running around, seeing the sun. All
Mhm.
of those things that we kind of take for granted within the wellness community is like seminal to, you know, your ability to learn, to focus, to for, you know, for just general psychological health, all of those things. And the schools that we were working in were primarily like, we worked in some of the poorest school districts in the country. We worked with kids who were on autistic spectrums. We worked with kids who were in and out of the foster care system. So we were working with like kids who would say would be the more difficult learners. And obviously they're dealing with like massive amounts of psychological stress and, all of these factors that are really rough on children. But what we were able to do was provide this experience for them that felt uplifting and the mandate I think for New York at the time was like 45 minutes of physical education a week, and so you've got like boys sitting in a classroom from
sounds like lockdown to me.
Oh yeah, no,
it's the same mandate.
So, yeah, absolutely. So 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night, they're within a school system.
Yeah,
right. I mean, just like within a box. And one of my best friends, who's a trainer, he's like, yeah, they put you into a playpen, then they put you into a classroom,
playpen,
then they put you in, yeah, and then they put you to a cubicle, and then they put you into a coffin. It's like it's just box to box to box to box,
yeah.
And so, I mean, there's just we have to start to understand the real dramatic cost to all of that stuff. Yeah, and I think having 3 kids and being under lockdown for the past couple of years, it's been very, very difficult for me to see what the educational experience is remotely. I'm like sitting next to my 8-year-old, listening to the way the teacher, this is a good school with like very passionate teachers, but so much of it is classroom management. It's like trying to activate some sort of experience in the kids where they can now focus on the thing that you want them to learn. And we've known this for so long. It's like, how hard is it to focus on an individual topic as you move from class to class? Like you're supposed to be a poet for 45 minutes and then a mathematician for 45 minutes when maybe you don't feel like a mathematician at this point, in the day. Now it's lunch and maybe that's your first meal of the day. And now you've had a big meal and now you're supposed to sit through another 45-minute class while you're digesting food. Every single aspect of that is so absurd to people who are like living their best experience of the world, where they're doing things based on intrinsic value, or, all this stuff. So for me, like moving into the documentary film space was a way to kind of really start to reset the narratives that our culture, mother culture, has surrounded us with by telling stories that get people to understand that there are larger systems at play within our culture that don't have a benefit for the individual, but have a benefit for production or, for growth at all levels, or, anything like that. So I started producing films probably about 7 or 8 years ago. Mainly we were coming in with documentary filmmakers with like 70% of their film done. So we could see what their argument was. And we would help them get to the finish line, finishing funds, out to the festival market, try to tell the story to advertisers, the distributors, and get them onto platforms so that people will see them. I mean, you can make amazing work, but if nobody sees the work, then you sort of failed as a filmmaker. And that's how I came across Sacred Cow. I listened to Diana Rogers on a podcast. She was in the sort of the origin story of Sacred Cow, which is a documentary primarily sort of focused on whether or not like eating meat actually does have, can we make the case for nutritional benefits of eating meat? Can we make the case for environmental benefits of putting animals back on the land? Why do we have livestock as the livestock that we have? Do they provide a benefit for the environment, for ecosystems, for biodiversity? Can we make an argument that there is the consolidation of the meat industry seems to have been made independent of farmers and ranchers anyway, but they seem to be bearing the cost of our consolidation of these industries under the guise of like efficiency and sustainability and all this other stuff. We've consolidated these industries to these multinational corporations that only care about profits, maximizing profits. And so could we advocate for an ethical view of meat consumption that benefits, all of these different factors, and then start to kind of dispel some of a lot of the plant-based vegan documentaries that were coming out. They're primarily focused on all of the harms that meat consumption brings, and using a lot of like slick editing and narrative storytelling that really gives a very skewed perspective of how we grow our food and how we've done that. So that's a short
bio. I've got to ask some questions because this is a podcast, not a lecture. I mean on that last point, like, of course, documentaries being what they are, they're selling a story, they're really passionate about what they do, and within that they're so invested, and it does skew. And it's just like it seems to be like a natural trajectory for when you really believe in something. And it's not even, you got to see the compassion there for people, even though it does so much, it can do so much fucking repercussion and harm. It's like, yes, they are so, we're all doing this to try and save us, or call it the planet, whatever you want to label it. But it's almost naive in some aspects of lots of documentaries are naive, because what they end up doing is not leaving room for they just say like this is a full stop and there's no two ways about it, when it's never that black and white, as you just said. But yeah, I want to go kind of back. I mean, you are the holistic Jamie Oliver of New York for me. Because I mean, it's a phenomenal. I didn't actually know about that. The scheme that you set up and worked with for what did you say, a decade? Is it still going?
It is. We folded into an organization that was primarily started in California called Edible Schoolyard. And they were doing something functionally very similar to us. Alice Waters, who was a chef in the 70s and 80s, who had built sort of a restaurant empire in California and Berkeley, moved into the Edible Schoolyard world, started it. And so we folded our organization in with theirs. And it's still growing. It's still doing, and it is a vegetarian organization. It's primarily focused on, foods. So, plants and growth and all of that stuff. So, I've never been necessarily antagonistic to the way that we grow our food, as long as it's real, as long as it's not like manipulated into this techno utopian, like vat grown microbial things that we seem to now be sort of pushing people to, these ultra processed foods like Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat or anything like that, is where like the rubber hit the road for me. I was like, something happened with plant-based where it now is moving into this whole what I would say is like a techno bubble, right?
Yeah.
We're going to be able to feed people these things, and we're going to move them all en masse into large cities, and then we're just going to rewild the rest of the planet, and it's the only sustainable option, which just it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it's almost that sort of same narrative. It's like we're independent of nature, and so we can put people into these like massive cities, and there's going to be no psychological ramifications because we're just going to feed them and bring all their stuff in and do all this stuff, and we're just going to rewild the rest of the planet, and it just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, because it's the same, trying to save the same problem on the same level which was created, and that's scarcity and it's lack, and it's all those kind of negative negative that kind of got us kind of into a bit of mess. And where we're at, it's troubling that decisions that get put out there, or are like that humans don't have feelings, or they don't care about, you know, meaningful things. And going back to what you said about the children just playing around in the dirt, and putting learning in context of like maths involved with that, and just having an interaction with, you know, if you wanted to corner off a certain, just farming in general, like just kids in agriculture, you know, putting sections of a garden for this and that, and it just makes like so much sense in that we should be educating people about this. I mean, yes, it will be probably have to be vegetarian, because I can't see a school trip going to the abattoir. That's not going to go well, is it?
Well, I mean, my team just went over to, they were in Sweden and Norway, and through a number of circumstances, they were able to take a middle school group out to, there was a sheep who was older, whose teeth were falling out, would have starved to death, right? Because it needs its teeth to chew the cud and all of that stuff. And so they were there, and they were witness to the slaughter. And I mean, it some of it really comes down to we do have a basic fear of death. I think Western culture is hyper focused on this idea of, like, you know, of living forever, or a real sort of, like, you know, seminal element of Western culture is a fear of death. That's why beauty products and all of these things are, you can charge a premium for, because it gives this notion that you're never going to age, or, you know, the way that Hollywood talks about aging actresses, right? So we have this culture now, and the kids were obviously, like, enthralled with it. There was a moment of shock, but then they really, like, were curious, and they saw how the other sheep responded, and the sheep were fine with it, and so the kids were fine with it. And so I think one of the aspects of Sick Cow that I thought was really interesting was the farmers talking about death, because they're like, we don't have the same discussions that city people have, because around us is death everywhere. You know, the fox eats the chickens, you know, there is this, I think you were talking about Biggest Little Farm, right? Yeah, so that is, with every new infestation of a new, like, problem that was coming in, there was a solution on the farm that would therefore feed another aspect of the farm. And so you saw this real circular economy happening on the farm as they grew. But at first, everything was a problem. The cow poops. Now you're infested with flies. The fly larvae grow in the poop. And now you've got flies everywhere, and they're carrying, you know, bacteria and disease. So then you put the chickens onto the ground after the cows are on pasture. The chickens eat all the larvae. And now you've created, and the chickens are taking all of that, because chickens are not vegetarian. They're eating the larvae, and then they're pooping that out. That's adding nitrogen back into the soil that the poop does as well, active nitrogen that the plants need to grow. The grasses flourish underneath, and then you put the cows back on, you know? And so, like, with every problem, I remember when they had that infestation of snails, so they put the ducks on. Ducks eat the snails, you know? So everything is sort of feeding into the system. And I think traditional farming understood that. And that's why there were always integrated systems that had cows, pigs, and poultry, which become the largest source of our protein nowadays, right? Or sheep or goats, ruminant animals, and then, you know, a terrific cascade of food happening all the way down, each one of them fertilizing the plants so the plants can grow as well, you know? But the 20th century saw the sort of the agricultural chemical industry supersede that, and we called it progress. You know, and so, you know, we invented, or the Germans invented in like 1906, a method of pulling nitrogen from the air, activating it, and making it into fertilizer, which is key to growth, right? It takes an enormous amount of fossil fuels in order to do that, but they were able to do it. But it also turned out that that was a perfect medium for explosives. And so you see the advent of World War One is only really possible through the way that we have manipulated our agricultural system to build something that is one part entirely destructive or can feed people. And that's, I think, the weird sort of like the world that we kind of live in, you know, because you're like, there's always a trade-off, right? When Timothy McVeigh blew up the FBI building, he used fertilizer. Right, filled a truck up with fertilizer and blew the entire half of the building off. You know, so it's a really interesting story. The
Yeah.
Haber-Bosch method is really interesting, and part of the reason he won the Nobel Prize that year in chemistry, but part of the reason why he isn't known anymore was he also created Zyklon B and mustard gas that was used in World War One, which was used on soldiers and then eventually used on his own family because he was Jewish. He was a Jewish scientist. But he was able to take nitrogen out of the air, which is an enormous amount of nitrogen in our atmosphere, make it into something that is usable to grow food. And what we ended up growing most of that was the staples that we find is primary in our food system nowadays. It's wheat, it's corn, it's soy, and rice. You know, and so that history is sort of buried within the early part of the 20th century, and sort of plays back and forth between the world wars and then feeding ourselves, and then sort of the chemical agricultural system that we have now, which is monocrops. Right. So now you could grow these huge amount of monocrops on these finite lands, pack them in, grow them, and then we essentially just took every single constituent part of that and then just fed ourselves. So you walk into the supermarket nowadays, you're just eating corn, wheat, and soy in various forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
With some sugar added on top, right? We've created a monoculture in our agricultural system, and we've created a monoculture in the way that we eat. And there's huge costs to that. And I'm sure you studied hunter-gatherers in terms of their body mass, their height, their teeth health, all of those things. We took away all variety from our diet to feed ourselves, and it was a caloric trade-off, right? So we traded calories to feed the growing world that we said was going to be sustainable, but no nutrients, and we just throw some nutrients on top of it. White bread with folic acid or whatever. But we're kind of going off a little bit. Sorry.
I'm letting you go off because it's in my mind, just like, yeah, it's fascinating stuff. It is the most important conversation. Our food is, right? Our food is the most important. We can survive without nothing else. It's right at the top of our priority list. But that's where I want to also, maybe pivot the conversation to the priorities not really being food. Like, we're all in our echo chambers, but I do step out of them now and again, as do we all. We go take a look at the service station, or that's you outside your echo chamber, or communal space, public spaces, or even just friends, family as well is a really interesting one of the generations, and really get a really good look into like the other generation and what they're eating now. And it's like hardly, I don't want to trigger anyone, but hardly anyone's priority is their food. But there's other things on the table. That's the thing. There's other things that please our senses and please our excite our desires and everything else. But why do you think food is it the story we've been told? Is it the disconnect from our bodies? What do you think is the main reason behind food not really being valued like it used to be?
I think one of the problems we have is the story that we tell ourselves is that we moved from out of abject, fight for survival, hunter-gatherer existences into an agricultural revolution. And that agricultural revolution led us to the industrial revolution. And that now is leading us into the technological sort of electrical revolution. And so we tell these things as if they're kind of a step-by-step process. But the truth of the matter is the agricultural revolution never stopped. And so everything that we have nowadays is because we've stratified society because of agriculture. So when you're living a hunter-gatherer existence, your possessions are whatever weapons you're bringing with you, whatever you can carry on your back. You're traveling about 7 miles a day. The way it's described is the original sort of affluent society. You're working about 15 hours a week, but it's also play. Everything you're doing is integrated into a system where if you're learning about hunting, it's a part of a playful process when you start to learn about hunting. And so moving into an agricultural revolution, what you're doing now is you're taking these seed grasses like wheat in Western Europe, rice cultivation in Asia, corn cultivation in the Americas, and now you're growing something that can be stored. And because it can be stored, now you have to build an entire edifice around guarding it, because then you will have people coming in trying to steal those stores. So now you have an army, you have a police, and then you've stratified society because now you need somebody who is in charge. And the only way to establish paternity is through kinship. So, it moves from father to son, then you get the divine right of kings, and these people are meant to rule, and so you go down this entire sort of like worldview that is born out of the agricultural revolution, that says some people are meant to be workers, some people are meant to be the paladins, and then the other people are meant to rule. And it's still the narrative that we tell ourselves. We have governmental institutions that have a disdain for the people that they rule over, right? Who, constantly lie to them, obfuscate the truth, all of that stuff. And so the sort of weird part about it is it's only made possible by the fact that we have harnessed the nature and the earth to feed ourselves. And so, one of the things I find very interesting from like a colonizer perspective is that when you go into a place that you seek to colonize, you want the land, you want the resources, you want mineral and mining rights, one of the first things you do is you take away their food, right? You take away their ability to hunt, their ability to live the lifestyle that they had before. And then you can assimilate them into your culture because you've taken away that freedom and that sovereignty of those people. So it's equally like part of the messaging. We give people the notion that the government is producing food for us. It's generally not for us. We subsidize multinational billionaires so that they can reap most of the profits from food. But I think it's part of that larger narrative about what the agricultural revolution is. And as soon as we started to harness nature towards that, we saw our population explode. Then, we move into arts and leisure and, getting people not surrounded around their food anymore. Nobody's growing stuff. Nobody's touching the food. And it's a perfect window into making them dependent upon a food system that they have actually no real control over. So we have about 13 companies that essentially own 90% of the world's food. We've consolidated most of that. And they just care about stock value and ownership of, profits. And a lot of them are behind these new plant-based, meats and stuff like that, because they're like, listen, we could feed these low nutrient food to animals and then people can eat the animals, or we can feed humans animal feed, and then we don't have to take any more of the risk with the animal, right? And that's essentially what they're doing. That's all that stuff is, right? And we'll make it like feel like the texture of meat because people are stupid and they'll, that's the notion that they have of the consumer, right? Is all we have to do is market and advertise a product to them. You care about the environment. Well, this is more environmentally sustainable. You care about this. Well, it takes this much to grow a cow, any number of different things. And all they really tried to do is mimic the texture of those foods. None of the nutritional value. Yeah. Everything else is added back in.
All the sustainability factor.
Yeah.
Nothing sustainable about an Impossible Burger.
Yeah. I mean, especially when it's being imported, where are the crops grown? How are they grown? I did a podcast interview with somebody who wrote about Planet Palm, the palm oil industry.
Yeah.
Heavily involved in child slavery, heavily involved in massive deforestation in Indonesia and West Africa. And most of that is to make cosmetics and processed food. It ends up in about 70% of processed food. And it seems to get away with everything, nobody talks about palm oil, right? It's this weird nebulous ingredient.
I feel like they used to, or they did over the period of time where it was really, but now other things have taken the baton, and taken the limelight.
Yeah.
Why? I don't know. Who's telling the story,
Yeah. Well, trans fats was the industry darling, right? So could you create something that was like butter? So solid at room temperature, but would melt when cooking. So if you wanted to make a cookie with trans fats, you could. It's cheaper than butter. But then when they realized there's like no part of it should be in your body at all, right? And so they had to sort of scramble to figure out a saturated fat that exists in nature that they could still produce cheaply. And palm oil sort of fits the bill. Coconut as well, but isn't as taste neutral as palm oil. So you saw this huge explosion, but most of it is just to make processed food. It's just to make junk. It's going to sit on a shelf for years.
So where do we go from here?
Oh, I don't know. What do you want?
What have I got? Okay, well, let's bring in, because there's always light, and there's so much light around all of this. If anything, technology and everything we've done is to show us what is not what is not sustainable. It's to show us what we can't do and can't get away with. Nature's always trying to tell us something, and it's just saying, well, this isn't good for you, and we're going to show you that by obesity, by cancer, by all the rest of it. And it just mimics the food systems worldwide, mimic, and what we feed ourselves mimic our lifestyles and how, and our diseases. So it's fascinating. But when you look at that through that lens, it's like, okay, cool. Let's work with this instead of trying to work against it and for us. And you mentioned within that, it was, the message I got was hoarding, like the hoarding capacity that we've just taken up. Like nothing hoards in nature. Like, yes, agriculture, a very short period of time, rereading Sapiens again, it's just phenomenal. And what we define as a long period of time, short period of time, agriculture, and these are the lessons, and this is where we're at. Suddenly it's like, fuck and all my DNA is like screaming out for something different, and I'm stuck in this house with some fluorescent light staring at a camera. And it's like, wow, my DNA is not having a good time. But yeah, and if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think I mean, I guess it comes down to the myth of perpetual progress, right? So we seem to have this idea that we're working towards something, and it is the mythology of our age that we are willing to sacrifice as many millions as we possibly can, with either people or forests or whatever, because we're moving towards something. And I think people are starting to really have a sort of a grip around the idea that may not necessarily be true. And so, when you look at sort of the colonizer mindset, there was 3 C's that they use. One was it was commerce, Christianity, and civilization. And so they would go into places and sell them on this idea of this greater progress that everybody was supposed to be on board with, right? We were going to create a multinational trading system so that everybody would reap the rewards of, the late 20th and 21st century. Everybody was going to be part of this larger paradigm of trade. And we call it the developing world, right? And so we go into places and who were in many ways very self-sustaining systems. Places like Kenya had its own textile trade, had its own agricultural system, had its own methodology of like trade that was deeply rooted in a national idea of self. And then you would have this sort of colonizer mindset, come in and say, well, listen, you can make a lot more money if you take all of these bountiful foods that you eat that are part of this, and you just grow coffee. You're just going to grow coffee now. And so the World Trade Organization, the World Economic Forum, all of these large sort of multinational groups essentially it sort of colonized the rest of the developing world. It was the new sort of colonization of the 20th century. It was through trade. And what ended up happening with that is it essentially decoupled every nation from their own degree of sovereignty. And so they became heavily dependent upon a system that they had actually no control over. So I had a conversation with a Malaysian farmer at a conference a few years back, and he was really heavily involved in the idea of a regenerative farming system because he had grown up with all of these farmers who would now bought into this idea and were essentially growing all this food. The food was being transported to Western Europe or the Americas, processed, and then the junk food is essentially what was dumped on his land. So you have these farmers who are like building this entire enterprise and never feeding the people that they saw around them anymore. And he was seeing these mass suicides of farmers because they were caught in the system and just heavily leveraged into debt and more dependent upon fertilizers and pesticides and agrochemicals and all this other stuff to like make the earth more fertile. And so they were caught in this net and they just couldn't get out. And so, for me, that's like a story that you kind of tell yourself. It's like you walk into these places, these, huge box stores with like everything you possibly ever want. There's a cost to all of it, and so like listening to you and the way that you're talking about it, and there's a generation of people who are just saying no, like, like we don't want this. We never asked for this. This was essentially determined by a small group of people. And it never seemed to the benefit of anybody, and so I think that mythos is slowly starting to kind of fade away. We're trying to figure out how to coexist in a system that isn't heavily dependent upon like going into these places. But for me, I worry a lot about the mineral and mining rights in places like the Congo that has a massive copper mines, some of the largest in the world, coltan, all of the stuff that we use for our cell phones, for electronics, for wind farms. Every single one of those things require resources from a country that is unfairly paid for those resources. It's estimated that close to $300 billion are excised from Africa every year. That if you were paying for the things that the price that you were supposed to pay for those, Africa would be fine. $300 billion a year is essentially stolen from their land. It's a massively mineral rich country that is, essentially just in the grips of, what I see is like a sort of globalization from the north, and China as well. I mean, we've seen China and Ethiopia and Kenya and all over the African continent as well. So it's a Western like idea, I think. So for us, I think it's, can we, like for my documentaries, it's like, can we tell large stories like this? Can we tell small stories? We did a film on mental illness. And I think if you study enough of hunter-gatherer societies, I think people who have a relationship with voices are sometimes valued within that society because they're hearing nature. Nature is talking to them. They will sometimes become shamans, or at least given a position of value within the society because they're in more touch with the forest than other people. But we treat mental illness here as something that we have to like lock away or or medicate or get rid of, like as if we have like an idea of what the perfect like mind is. But if you read psychological textbooks, every single one of the ways that they talk about mental illness, everything is a pathology.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting because you look at it and you're like, how did they come up with like every single thing that part of the human experience is now pathologized? Your parents pass away. Well, you're depressed because you've lost somebody, right? Well, if you're depressed for more than 2 weeks, then you have a chemical imbalance. Like, how absurd is that?
I know. What's the book in America there's this kind of Bible of mental disorders?
Yeah. The DSM.
Yeah, the DSM. And it's just insane. It's insane.
Yeah.
I heard once who's telling the story? It's not humans telling the story anymore. It's corporations telling the story of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Which is
profound. And but I was recently reading James Davies, who's I think he's an English writer, did a whole sort of history of psychology, and he it's called Cracked. The book is called Cracked, and it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating to read because he's interviewing the people who are in charge of the original writing of the DSM. It's like 13 men sitting in a boardroom having a conversation. What is this? What is that? What is this disorder? Agoraphobia, depression. And he just goes through and interviews the people surrounded around that idea. Like the DSM, I think 5 came up with the diagnosis of ADHD, right? So what happens when you diagnose something, when you create a specific target for what a problem is? Well, now you can pathologize it and you can medicalize it, and then you can prescribe for it. And so you saw this massive jump in people prescribing medications to children, to anybody who couldn't sit in a classroom for 8 hours a day. So much of it is about behavior modification, but it's also about pathologizing, like the human experience of like wanting to run around and be in nature and socialize and communicate. It is an absolutely amazing read, and the criticisms that I've seen of the book are like, they're like, well, it's an unfair picture of psychology, history of psychology. But he's actually interviewing the people who wrote the DSM, who came up with these things. So it's their story. He's quoting from them. He's going to their houses and saying, well, how do you feel about the way that you pathologize childhood? And so they're direct quotes from these people who are infinitely responsible for for that. And for them, it was about solving a problem, right? So if you were institutionalized with schizophrenia in Cincinnati, and then you went to New York, a psychologist may diagnose you with something else. And so they had to come up with something, a dictionary of terms and terminology. But everything, I don't know, it's just it's really hard to kind of conceptualize the way that we've like systematized our world so that everything becomes that. So for a long time, the DSM had this problem with mourning. So how long is proper mourning before it actually goes into chronic depression? And so they had what they called like the 2 week or 2 month paradox, right? And so they were like, well, if it's longer than this period of time, then you actually have that chemical imbalance and you need to be medicated. And so they couldn't really square it because, I mean, say you're a teenage daughter and your father passes away suddenly. Like, what is the normal time that you're supposed to feel depressed about that? Like, this person that you've loved, you've been with your entire life. How long is a long enough period of time? Like, we used to have mourning. People would like dress in mourning for a year. And so the DSM-7, in order to sort of square that circle, they just got rid of the 2 week, 2 month paradox. They just like, we can't deal with it. So now if you're depressed over at all, you have some sort of chemical imbalance, you know. So you're not allowed to feel like I mean, the human experience is like mind-boggling. I mean, the depths of emotions that we can feel, from like ecstasy and agony and all of that stuff, like it's so hard to have to experience people experiencing the depths of what human feeling can be. But you can't take that away. It just takes away what it means to be a human. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm listening to a great audiobook at the moment called Humankind. I think it's not long come out. It's by Robert someone or another. But it's phenomenal, and it's answering the question that there are good people. We are good. Every human is is a good person. There's no one who's born evil. Like, but with this Hobbesian view of the world of like, and Rousseau and all these people in like the 16th century who really like, they really cemented the collective view on who humans are and what we're capable of, and if there wasn't authority or signs up saying don't run and don't panic in an emergency, it would be chaos. Like there's two planets. One, a plane crashes and everyone panics on the plane. Everyone tries, it's every man, woman for themselves. Is that the reality, or is it the reality that everyone looks out for each other and they let the children go, the women go first, and everyone's protecting the elderly, etc.? But it's yes, evidence suggests that it's the second one. But we have this more, I think, in my father's generation, he has this kind of view of like, if we didn't have all these things making sure people play by the rules, it would be chaos. Yeah, and I've always had the feeling that's not true.
Yeah,
and I think the evidence suggested not. But yeah, it's
there was a podcast that came out it was a TED Talk that came out a few years ago, and they were telling the story of the way that we've systemized the notion of like whether or not people can actually have the autonomy to be in their working lives, to be compassionate. And one of the stories was centered around a hospital janitor who would go into, he had to clean this number of rooms over a period of time. And he had to, so there's certain, and he has to do it kind of a check off, room 237 at 11:15. And so there were these gaps where he wasn't in the room. And so he gets called in front of his superintendent and sits him down. He's like, listen, this is what you're supposed to do. And he said, well, I walked into this room. The family had just arrived. The father had had a heart attack. And they had just flown in to go see him. This is the first experience of them. I'm not going to go and mop around this experience. And so he was like, I will get to the rooms. I just won't do them in the time that but the superintendent couldn't understand that, and so he talks a lot about the way that we've kind of and we move from crisis to crisis in a lot of those things. So his secondary story, can I tell this one? So father and son go to like a soccer game, and the son is sitting, he's watching the game, and he goes and he's like, oh, I'm going to go get a hot dog. And he asks the son if he wants anything. And he said, oh, I'll have a lemonade. So he goes up and he orders a hot dog and a lemonade, and the guy at the stand says, well, I don't have lemonade, but I have hard lemonade, like Mike's Hard Lemonade, which is an alcoholic drink. And so he doesn't know what hard lemonade is. He just figures it's probably like spicy. And so he gets it for his son. He goes and he sits down, and one of the security guards sees his son drinking this hard lemonade. He must be like 8 years old. This is in the US. And so they call an ambulance. The son gets taken to the hospital. During in-processing, they remove the father from the son. They say that he's an abuser now. He has to go to court, right? And the kid's blood alcohol content is nothing. He probably had like 3 sips of it. He has to go to court to get his son back. The judge is actually apologizing to him. He's like, listen, I can't release your son to your mother's custody until you move out of the house. So he has to go and like rent a hotel room to move out of the house because he's an abuser. And he was like, then I can release your son to you, you know? And even the judge was like, this is the most ridiculous story, but we systematized the way that even a judge can deal with the situation, and and forced him in a place where this simple event has now like created enormous disruption in this family's life, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just ridiculous.
In many cases, with like throwing the baby with the bathwater, you know, you put one thing and then just be like, well, what if there's this situation? Well, you know, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. There are going to be, but it's mad. It's mad. So yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for coming on, man. It's been fun.
Yeah.
It's been really fun.
Hey, let me ask you a question. So,
yeah.
And this is just off of your topic, and then we can go. There was so Daniel Quinn is one of my favorite writers. He wrote a book on a really interesting book called Ishmael.
Yes. And I was looking at that today, funny enough, because I was listening to Tangentially Speaking. I know you're a fan of Chris Ryan.
Yeah.
Do you meet him once? I'm sure he said you had some drinks in New York. I'd love to know what happened there.
No, I was in LA. I was out in California, and I was visiting a sculptor friend of mine, and so Chris ended up coming by. And then we were supposed to like go to Joe Rogan that night or something like that, but I had other plans. So I wanted to kind of meet him because he's been in my ear for a really long time. I've listened to so many of his podcasts. Just a really interesting independent thinker. But Daniel Quinn kind of talks about this, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. He said that hunter-gatherer societies don't forbid human behavior. What they do generally is they try to create an environment where the wound that was created is healed, right? So so much of our society is about forbidding behavior. Don't cheat on your wife, don't steal, don't do all of these different things. But I think hunter-gatherers really understood that these are all part of like a learning process for human beings. And so it's really interesting to like conceptualize the idea of like healing the wound as opposed to forbidding an idea. Because Western society is very much about forbidding. It's like, don't have dirty thoughts.
When you shut something away and don't look at it, then it's a problem. When it's behind closed doors and you just you turn the other way, it's like you're ignoring the actual. It's almost like when I've done that to myself, it's like I'm afraid of that in me, so I just don't look at it, and it's kind of a discomfort that it's happening, and I don't want anything to do with it, because it's like, this is an anomaly, or it's so that for me, it's a fascinating concept, isn't it? To have that and not and to heal through that, to learn through that, rather than just punish that we think is wrong.
It's just an interesting way to pathologize an idea. I mean, you just read the Bible and it says, do not covet thy neighbor's wife or his goods or his donkey.
I don't think humans respond well to orders without like context, or without just being ordered around by maybe someone that you don't even know. That in this society is I think goes against nature. It could be part of the conversation. Or you don't trust. Like there's so much mistrust around. It's just evident that we don't trust law and order, because it's, you know, we see the contradictions, or the government, we see we see it in plain sight, all the all the contradictions that happen. And it's like, what we're supposed to still play by the rules even though they don't make sense. And that's just us just disconnected. And it's weird. The thing that came up with me in that, though, looking at a lot of hunter gatherers, they I think in Sapiens they talk how brutal some, and it changed from different regions and different parts of hunter gatherer communities, but they could have been quite brutal. They're brutal to the weak or the young or the elderly that was slowing the group down, but they didn't have a word for almost kill. It was almost like they'd leave people to die, and we were content with that because they knew it was for the collective. There was this collective idea there. It was never about the individual. I think that kind of leads into that.
I have there are some societies that won't name a child until 5, because there was just so much child mortality. And Inuit, there are a lot of people who go out and hunt and never come back, and so there's it's a really dangerous landscape. And so because I think they have a relationship with death that is omnipresent, I don't know if they have this sort of same relationship that we have. But I've always sort of had balked at the notion that was a callous event when somebody was falling behind an elderly or a crippled person. I still think because it still affects us so deeply, I think it is psychologically damaging to them as well. And I think it's, most anthropology in the early 20th century was governed by a very, very small group of, fundamentally rabid white supremacist individuals. Madison Grant being one of them, who wrote a book that became Hitler's Bible. It's called The Passing of the Great Race. And he was, anthropology was in its infancy in the early part of the 20th century. And it took Frank Boas and Margaret Mead and Zora Neale Hurston. Margaret Mead and Zora Neale were both students of Frank Boas to really push back against the notion that these primitive societies were cannibalistic and monstrous. And, so I think it bears a lot to sort of read through the lines of what these early anthropological explorers, the lens that they were viewing the world. If you got time for one more story, I'll tell you. There was a Indiana Jones-esque French anthropologist in the 70s. I think his name was Napoleon Chagnon, who went in and he studied a Brazilian hunter and gatherer group that name escapes me right now. That he was like, oh yeah, they're very militant. They're constantly poking and prodding their children and making them cry, and they're very warlike. And so, it was all under the notion of like, are we more like chimpanzees or are we like bonobos, right? The sort of the Chris Ryan story. And so Napoleon sort of came out and he told the world, this is what we are. We're a warlike sort of chimpanzee group, and look at these hunter gatherers. Look at how aggressive and warlike that they are. And what he doesn't tell you is that he introduced scarcity to that group. So he brought in machetes as gifts. And so now, like, only 4 people could have machetes and tin pots. And he created an environment, and he started asking them very leading questions. They don't talk about their ancestors. And so he would incessantly ask them. So he creates strife within these communities. and then he would witness it, all to sort of like prove this preconceived a priori notion that he had to begin with. And I think that that is like, we have to be sort of semi-aware of that when we're looking at the lens that early explorers and anthropologists look at the world, you know? And so, yeah, I just think it's an interesting kind of story. And I don't, you know, put up a lot of, I'm not necessarily saying like, you know, they're perfect. Obviously there's, you know, you, like Chris will say it, he's like, you have people who have weapons all the time, right? You have to figure out ways to kind of dispel aggression. Like they're the same as us. We're aggressive, we're lovers, we're compassionate, we're caring, we can be callous and cruel. We have all of that in us. It's just the sort of beast that you feed. And so, you know, we don't necessarily have to hold them up as if they were an angelic, you know, like species that existed before us, but they did know how to coexist in an environment for way longer than 10,000 years, and exist in a way that benefited the environments that they were in, right? So they were natural sort of gardeners of the places that they lived. And they provided a lot of ecological function and all of that stuff. And they were, you know, just as weird as humans can be, you know, just in terms of sexuality, in terms of open sexuality. Margaret Mead talks about transgender Native Americans. She talks about homosexuality in Fijis. You know, like all of that stuff has been part of the human experience for a very long time. The notion that like any, you know, all of this stuff is a nurture argument has always just been so fallacious to me, because we've seen it everywhere on the planet when we move into places where we see cultures that aren't governed by the lens that we see the world. You know, so we can leave it at that if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love to know as well, don't we? It keeps us safe. We love to like that black and white thinking. It's okay, that's why. And I'm okay with that. And then I'll move forward about my day. And it's like, well, maybe that's not true. And maybe, maybe you just want to know the reason of why humans are like this. You know, maybe it's not. But yeah, amazing, mate. I love talking about this stuff. It's like my favorite thing to do. It really is.
Cool.
So yeah,
cool.
I'm keen to share some books and some resources. That'll be cool, man.
Oh, sure. Books. Normally I have like the go-to. I mean, Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein.
Okay.
I think is really wonderful. It's a really wonderful book. One of my favorites of all time. One of my favorite writers is Trevanian, very obscure, really interesting writer. Just the world of imagination that exists in his head was unbelievable. And he wrote a book called Shibumi, which is so much fun to read. It'll teach you everything you need to know about the 20th century within like a spy novel. So much fun, really, really cool. And it just created one of the greatest characters. Like he's so much fun to read. I mean, Daniel Quinn's work is really good. I love he has an interview towards, it's a book called Daniel Quinn, If They Give You Line Paper, Write Sideways. Okay. And it's an interview with a student where she's trying to get him an understanding of how his mind works. And how to think like a Martian anthropologist. So somebody who hasn't imbibed any culture at all, what would they think of the weird morals and customs that we just sort of take for granted? So those are always fun. I'm most active on Instagram, Primate Kitchen. You get a weird working on my mind. So
yeah, definitely.
So sustainability, all of that stuff, but just from a dissenter's point of view. And that's about it. Sacred Cow is out. You can find it on iTunes. There is a companion book to it that goes much more deeply than the 90-minute film. And then deathinthegarden.org is my latest film project with Jake and Marin, who are just super scrappy, living in a van, just trying to, change the way that we see, or at least open our eyes to what culture is. And how oppressive it can be. And so just kind of creating a narrative around a new idea of what humans are, one that isn't a broken species that is like just, inherently going to destroy the planet. So really good, really smart.
That sounds cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
narrative
out.
filmmakers. No, this is the one that we're in production on right now. So they have a podcast as well. So what we decided to do differently for this documentary is like release every interview, so you don't get sound bites. Obviously the film will have to have sound bites, but you get to hear the entire context of the conversation. You can, what you don't get to see in a lot of like really slick documentaries is that perfect cut that makes somebody say something that they maybe didn't intend, which happens a lot in documentaries. And so for us, like, we were like, listen, this is about the environment. This is about the human species. Are we fundamentally broken? Or were we kicked out of the Garden of Eden? Or did we just decide to sell ourselves a different story that we now need to change? We're not fucking around. We want people to see what the story is. And obviously we're choosing the people we're interviewing. So it's going to be biased. Every documentary is, but we want it to be as transparent as possible. So deathinthegarden.org, and they have all of their social media on there as well. So that's about it.
Nice. Yeah. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah. I love your integrity and everything you're standing for. So it's good. It's good to chat with you.